So, what does it really mean to be free? Back in 1950, just a few years after India's independence, the Supreme Court had to tackle that very question. This was in the landmark case of A.K. Gopalan versus the state. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some dry legal dispute, it was a battle for the very soul of the Constitution, and its outcome would define what personal liberty meant in India for decades to come.
I want you to imagine this for a second. You're arrested, you're put in prison, and when you ask why, the government just says, "We don't have to tell you." Not even your lawyer, not even a judge. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that high-stakes scenario wasn't hypothetical at all. It was the absolute central question in the A.K. Gopalan case. At the very center of this whole storm was a man named A.K. Gopalan. He was a prominent communist leader, and you have to remember, this was post-independence India. The political climate was tense, and the new government was laser-focused on maintaining order, whatever it took. Gopalan's activism put him on a direct collision course with a state that was determined to flex its muscles, and that set the stage for this epic clash between national security and individual freedom. Now, Gopalan was no stranger to jail. He'd been in and out of detention since 1947, but on March 1st, 1950, everything changed. While he was already in prison, an officer hands him a new detention order. But this time, it wasn't for a crime he had actually committed, but for one the government was afraid he might commit in the future. And the justification for this? A brand new and very controversial piece of legislation.
That law was the Preventive Detention Act of 1950. What it did was give the government this incredible power to lock people up, not for what they'd done, but to prevent them from doing something in the future that might be a threat. It was a seriously powerful tool, and in Gopalan's view, it was completely unconstitutional.
So what does Gopalan do? He takes his fight to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And he didn't just challenge his own arrest. No, he challenged the entire Preventive Detention Act itself. He argued it was a direct assault on the fundamental rights that India's brand new constitution had just promised its citizens.
His legal team basically built their case on four huge constitutional pillars. They argued the act violated Article 14, the right to be treated equally. They said it violated Article 19, which protects freedoms like speech and movement. And most critically, they pointed to Articles 21 and 22, the very heart of protection for life, liberty, and the safeguards against being arrested for no good reason.
But there was this massive hurdle in their way, Section 14 of the Act. It basically created a legal black box. It explicitly forbid anyone, Gopalan, his lawyers, anyone, from telling a court the reasons for the detention. Think about that paradox for a second. How is a court supposed to decide if an arrest is legal if it's literally forbidden from knowing why the arrest happened in the first place?
So this all set the stage for a major legal showdown. In one corner, you had M.K. Nambir fighting for Gopalan, and in the other corner, you had the top lawyers for the state of Madras and the Union of India. The battle lines were officially drawn.
Okay, so after hearing all the arguments, the six-judge bench delivered its verdict. And their decision? Well, it would shape the course of personal liberty in India for the next 30 years by taking a very literal and, as we're about to see, a very, very narrow view of what the Constitution actually meant.
All right, to really understand the verdict, you have to get this one key distinction. Think of it like a recipe. The idea of procedure established by law means the court only checks if the government followed the steps in the recipe correctly. It can't question whether the recipe itself is any good. But due process of law, on the other hand, lets the court actually taste the final dish to decide if the law itself, the recipe, is fair and just and reasonable. Gopalan's team was arguing that real justice required the court to be a food critic, not just a line cook checking off boxes.
But the majority of the judges, they disagreed. They took a super literal reading of the Constitution. They ruled that Article 21 only guarantees procedure established by law. In other words, as long as Parliament passed a law and the government followed that law to the letter, the detention was constitutional. Whether that law was fair or reasonable, they said that was, for them, totally irrelevant. This led to a kind of split decision. On the one hand, the court upheld the Preventive Detention Act itself, which gave the government the power it wanted. But on the other hand, they struck down Section 14, that crazy secrecy clause. They declared it was unconstitutional to stop a court from reviewing the very reasons for a detention.
The final vote was 5-1. A pretty strong majority, right? But here's the thing about the law. Sometimes a single dissenting voice can echo through history, planting a seed for future change. And that is exactly what happened here. That lone voice belonged to Justice Fazl Ali.
He wrote this incredibly powerful dissent that offered a completely different way of looking at fundamental rights. One that saw them not as separate little boxes, but as an interconnected web designed to protect human liberty.
You see, Justice Fazl Ali argued that the procedure established by law couldn't just be an empty ritual. He believed it had to include the principles of natural justice. You know, the right to be heard, the right to know what you're accused of. For him, these weren't optional extras. They were the very soul of the law. A procedure without justice, he argued, was totally meaningless.
And so, for nearly 30 years, the Gopalan decision was the law of the land, giving the state enormous power. But constitutions are living things, you know. Their interpretations evolve. And Justice Fazl Ali's dissent, even though it was ignored at the time, was just waiting in the wings for its moment to completely change Indian history.
That moment finally arrived in 1978, in the case of Maneka Gandhi versus the Union of India. In what was a stunning reversal, the Supreme Court overturned its own 28-year-old precedent. It declared that the procedure in Article 21 must be fair, just, and reasonable. The lone dissenting voice from 1950 had finally become the law of the land.
The Maneka Gandhi judgment was a total game changer. It breathed new life into Article 21. It essentially brought the principles of due process into the Indian Constitution, transforming the entire landscape of personal liberty. From that point on, any law that restricted someone's freedom had to be not just procedurally correct, but fundamentally fair.
And you know, the struggle that began with A.K. Gopalan's detention is still at the heart of debates all over the world. How does a nation strike that perfect balance between the security of the state and the liberty of the individual? It's a really delicate, ongoing negotiation.